took me many years to find a way in which I could deal with the question of new and different kinds of formal approaches, to really question my assumptions about structure. And to do that, I had to start writing my spatial pieces, my collages, to sort of break away from old structures. All three pieces are very different in some ways. They share certain expressive characteristics, of course, but the basis of the pieces are very, very different. Skin, go back in time to Skin, 2015. I found it really hard, but I made a decision that it was time to dedicate some years to writing for the voice. I always found it difficult, the idea to be setting a text. So how do you deal with text? How do you deal with the written word? And what does a singer mean when a singer stands on the stage, raises one eyebrow? It's already a dramatic statement without them saying anything, without there being a title, without there being a text. My representative back then, Graham Hayter, was also working for Juliet, and he sent me some videos of her doing a couple of Georges Apergiz's Récitation. And I was taken by something about her face, the way in which she delivered a text, the way in which she did it, the fragility, and also the clarity of her expression. And I asked if I could write for her. Then she came to visit me, and the big question was, what do I do? She has to breathe. Human fallibility, this fragility, this person who has to breathe. And the phrases are quite short. I said, how do I deal with this? So I started experimenting with recitation, with text. She experimented with me and for me, working on the spoken word, suppressing the meaning of the spoken word, controlling the duration of a recitation, and also really working on what to do with the in-breath, so it is integrated into the composition. I loved working with someone who was a real team player, who came from a Baroque choir background. Yeah, so it's not a diva. We're talking about someone whose sound integrates in the same way as almost like sinus tones of the accordion integrate into the ensemble. And her voice has a wonderful purity, which I think makes it very malleable and very interesting to mix with other instruments. The text actually came through the composition process. It's like a musical thread that is woven through the piece. Is a surface that becomes audible, becomes comprehensible, and then disappears within the web of sound.
Whose voice? No one's. There is no voice. There is no one. There's a voice without a mouth. And somewhere a kind of hearing, something compelled to hear, and somewhere a hand. It calls that a hand. It wants to make a hand, or if not a hand, something somewhere that can leave a trace of what is made, of what is said. You can't do this less. No, that's romancing, more romancing. There is nothing but a voice murmuring a trace.
I think because of Skin and because of back then my intense preoccupation, again, that was like a third phase of preoccupation with the late novels of Beckett, there's a lot of Beckett vocabulary in this text. I thought it was actually good to bring the Beckett in. And the old poem of his, Alba, which I think was 1935 or 1937, a very early poem, which is a very Joycean language in a way. It's very elaborate. It really has a lot to do with Skull, I think. So these two poems, it's not that they inspired the piece, it's that they accompanied me on their way, and they're texts that I came back to again and again, which really I felt with language were so exceptional that they managed to actually embrace some of the metaphysical questions that one asks oneself when you're working as an artist. Scar was a pivotal moment for me. I was beginning to write much more dense music, beginning to investigate different kinds of rhythmic patterns and formal organization. And that piece was a big question mark for me. And at the time I was unhappy with the piece because I felt that formally it wasn't quite going as far as I wanted to. So it was the beginning of a whole new, for me, a new compositional era in a way. And I really felt that I would like to reply to this piece. I would like to actually take this piece and move beyond it. What are these melodic fragments that become that sort of surface every now and again in Scar and then end the piece, and why, and what do they mean, and where do they lead me, and what is this rhythmic material, and what else could I do with it? So it raised a lot of questions, and I felt Scar would be a very good way of moving forward. For the first half of Scar is very much this piano duo left and right on the stage, which set off these percussive attacks. So that was super important as a sort of really the springboard from which the piece actually grew at the beginning, the sort of explosive gestural material. In Skull, it was very clear that although certain things had to be kept from the other pieces, for example, the percussion setup, you can't then have a completely new percussion setup necessarily for Skull. So I had to use basically the same percussion instruments, but use them in different ways with different points of reference. So it was like, how do I deal with my accordion, piano and electric guitar setup, which I feel is so important for an ensemble piece. So I got rid of the pianos and I decided to give the electric guitar a different partner in this context. Also, the piece is so much more lyrical. It's polyphony basically, isn't it? And it was my first attempt really to go back to that method of writing. So these long melodic lyrical lines work much better, I think, like this than with the piano. So, but it was really about establishing a different a basic timbral palette from the other two pieces, which meant moving away from the piano. The whole piece works very much with slight kind of microtonal deviations, which are in an expressive way. That works well on the cork, very well on the cork. It's a beautiful sort of vintage instrument. You have two keyboards and you have a pitch dial. So both keyboards can change by a whole tone, yeah, with a dial. So you can be playing the same note on both keyboards, and you can be an eighth of a tone or a fraction of a tone or half a tone, or you can change the pitch modulation while they're playing. Nice, it means working with microtones in a very flexible way. It's not specific, it's not exactly a 16th or exactly a third tone. It's very much an expressive timbral difference. Composition, we are making music. Yeah, we are actually making music now. We should be always involved in the actual everyday making of music. And I think as a composer, there seems to be some very dry interpretation of what we actually do. We are musicians, working with a live musician, experiencing the relationship between the musician and his instrument. It's inspiring, and it reminds me of who I am and where I come from. It reminds me that I am also a musician, yeah. These long-term working relationships with musicians, different kinds of musicians, that is incredibly rewarding. You establish a certain trust towards each other. You're in communication with them all the time. And then I find a notation. I say, okay, I've got this notation. I'm keeping it as clear as possible. What do you see? What do you relate to? What is necessary? What is superfluous? And this kind of feedback is so helpful, so rewarding, and you feel like you're working together, you know? The way in which the wind relate to each other, it's very special for every ensemble. And that's fascinating to get to know it, to begin to understand the inner dynamics of an ensemble and how they make music together.